Okay, so just a quick content note before I get stuck in as well. There will be a brief mention of suicide, and there's going to be some discussion of sexual and sexualized violence later, as well as Orientalist imagery and Sylvia Plath poems as well. So big thanks first of all to Polly for inviting me to contribute, and also it's great to be speaking at the ICS as well, who've been so instrumental in my postdoctoral research as well. So thank you to Valerie for always answering my emails. I'm also really delighted to be involved because two key people whose research I position mine as being in conversation with are Polly and also Amy Hines, who gave the first paper in this series, because it was Polly's work in her thesis on Elizabeth Cook that really planted the seed for my own current thinking. She didn't know I was going to say this, by the way, so I'm not a plant. But what Polly was wrestling with in her thesis was the way that Elizabeth Cook's work, and particularly its quite erotic, ambivalent presentation of an episode of sexualized violence, exceeded some of the quite simplistic narratives that are often told in classical reception scholarship about quote-unquote feminist classical receptions. Polly's work was exploring routes for how scholars might navigate and theorize those texts in a much more sophisticated way, that kind of took account of those ambivalent presentations. And then Amy Hines's work was coming at it from a slightly different way, where she was looking at texts that are celebrated in popular media as feminist classical receptions, and the fact that they often have quite problematic elements in them. And so there's a great essay Amy published on Eidolon called Rape or Romance that I really recommend you read if you haven't written. So that's kind of where I'm positioning my work, with other people who have also felt some dissatisfaction with some of the dominant scholarly paradigms in reception studies for the way that we talk about women's classical receptions and feminist receptions in particular. So, as I say, my work's founded in a sense of dissatisfaction shared with others about these dominant scholarly paradigms, and a particular dissatisfaction with what gets both overlooked and also occluded in dominant narratives about women's work with myth. I'm particularly disillusioned with the ways in which these narratives, particularly in their popular neoliberal white feminist form, in which Greco-Roman texts are constructed as sources of empowering feminist narratives. I'm disillusioned with the ways that these narratives have been co-opted by the discipline, to use Danny Bostick's phrasing, as a counterproductive counter-narrative, or to use Luke Richards' phrasing as propaganda for classics. So I'm talking about the way that big C classics absorbs and instrumentalizes reception studies to distract from and to evade a sincere engagement with its histories of racism, classism, and misogyny. The idea that, oh, classics can't be misogynist, look at X reception, for example. In turn, the mainstreaming of these kinds of feminist reception narratives has enabled the discipline to achieve a few things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but one, it's turned reception studies into the primary vehicle for classics' relentless commodification of difference, as bell hooks once said of capitalism. Two, it's sidelined the more radical analyses of power contained in, for example, delineations of Black feminist and womanist reception traditions. So Emily Greenwood's current work on Black Sappho, for example. And three, it shut down the imaginative space for case studies that are anything less than positive about the value, the cross-cultural universal relevance, and the empowering potential of classics for feminists. And I'm thinking here both about the way that any example of a reception that classicists don't like is dismissed as a misappropriation of the classics. But I'm also thinking about feminists' psychic investments in reception studies as something we might find reassuring, or as a justification for our continued participation in a discipline that has historically and still is entangled with colonialism, racism, misogyny, classism. And I'll come back right at the end to that thread about psychic investments as it relates to comedy. So in my work on Plath, then, I'm attempting to anticipate and refuse the cannibalizing appetite of classics. And today I want to look at how Plath's comic practice, her comic engagement with the classical, has suggested ways to help me do that. As Polly mentioned, I'm writing a book on Plath and the classics, and it's become clear that one of the key characteristics of Plath's approach to Greco-Roman literature is its consistent comic tone, which operates variously in the modes of irony, parody, and satire. But this has only been an undercurrent in the book so far, and so I'm glad to take the opportunity to draw out some of Plath's comic approaches to non-comic classical texts a little bit more, and test out some ideas with you as well. I've mentioned irony, parody, and satire, but I ultimately went with burlesque for my title because it's a form that captures the theatricality and meta-theatricality of Plath's reception practice, and particularly her use of the striptease in her later poems. And also because burlesque is a form that stages the power dynamics that circulate between performer and audience, between poet and reader, and we might say between source and target text as well. So you might not associate Plath with comedy, and one of the reasons that Plath's comic streak has been overlooked is because of the biographical determinism that has dominated readings of her poetry, and this is especially true of her classical allusions. If people know anything about Plath, it's that she died by suicide, that she had a history of psychoanalytic treatment, that she was married to Ted Hughes, and that in the final months of her life, she wrote these searing poems of grief and rage. Weighed down by this biographical detail, discussions of Plath's poetic allusions to the figure of Electra, for example, typically take these allusions as evidence of Plath's autobiographical identification with Jung's Electra complex. This biographical determinism was established early as a critical trope, and it was aided in large part by the poet Robert Lowell's foreword to Plath's posthumously published collection Ariel in 1966, which claimed that in her late poems, Sylvia Plath becomes herself, certainly not another poetess, but one of those super real, hypnotic, great classical heroines, a Dido, Phaedra, or Medea. Everything in these poems is personal, confessional. So when Plath's life is constructed as itself a Greek tragedy, with each of her poems read as moments in a teleological, biographical narrative inexorably leading to the poet's death, there's little room for the comic in the ensuing literary analysis. But I also think Plath's comic streak has been overlooked because her classical burlesques are often at the gallows humour end of the comic spectrum. And the bleak comic vision of many of her poetic speakers is closest to the grim comedy of a figure such as Shakespeare's Hamlet or the characters who populate the plays of Samuel Beckett. In one of the only treatments of Plath's comedy, the critic J.D. O'Hara notes that both Plath and Beckett specialise in endgame humour, the comedy of the psychological lost cause, who can find occasionally a grace but never a saving grace. I agree with O'Hara's assessment that Plath's readers are reluctant to hear the accents of comedy in her work, especially of that brand of comedy that implies it is too late to evade the crime or to seek help. And I think they've been reluctant to accept the full pessimistic relevance of Plath's comedy. I think this bleak brand of humour plays a role in why Sylvia Plath hasn't yet received any significant attention in feminist classical reception scholarship, despite her early canonisation as a proto-feminist poet in feminist literary studies. In her survey of classical reception in modern women's poetry, for example, Rowena Fowler concludes that Plath offers, quote, no comfortable answers, unquote, to the question of whether myth, quote, is something women can call on to give voice to our own concerns, unquote. The poems that I'll discuss today largely confirm Fowler's observation that there is something uncomfortable about Plath's reception practice. But I'm interested in probing that discomfort and attempting to think through it. I'm going to begin with something lighter then, partly to show you the range of Plath's comedy, and also so you get an idea of how her comic approach to the classical evolves over time. So in October 1956, not long after arriving in the UK to read English at the University of Cambridge, Plath wrote a pair of parodic poems on the difficulty of conjuring up a dryad and on the plethora of dryads. The two poems are playing with Ovid's Metamorphoses and with the epic's theme of the woman as landscape. But rather than engaging with or revoicing a particular myth from the Metamorphoses, Plath uses Ovid as a cipher for masculine poetry making broadly. The central conceit of the first poem on the difficulty of conjuring up a dryad is a case of writer's block so severe that the woman poet has sought medical attention. I'll just read these first 3 stanzas. Ravening through the persistent bric-a-brac of blunt pencils, rose-sprigged coffee cup, postage stamps, stacked books clamour in York, neighbourhood cockcrow, all nature's prodigal backtalk, the vaunting mind snubs impromptu spiels of wind and wrestles to impose its own order on what is. With my fantasy alone, brags the importunate head, arrogant among rook-tongued spaces, sheep greens, finned falls. I shall compose a crisis to stun sky blackout, drive gibbering mad trout, cock, ram, that balk so calm on my jealous stare, self-sufficient as they are. But no hocus pocus of green angels, damasks with dazzle the threadbare eye. My trouble, doctor, is I see a tree, and that damned scrupulous tree won't practise wiles to beguile sight, e.g. by cant of light concocted Daphne. My tree stays tree. The contrast between the impotence of the cold vision of the woman poet, who must thieve what she can, and the easy inspiration visited upon the moon-eyed rival male poet is obviously comic. Nor can we hardly take seriously the woman poet's jealousy of the kind of poetry populated by radiant nymphs and crows that's so clearly a pastiche of Ovid and Ted Hughes. Yet the poem's comedy is undercut from its opening verb, ravening. It's a euphemism for rape that's still used in translations of Ovid today. But it's also an explicit signal that Plath has pinpointed exactly the representational logics that structure Ovid's epic poem. The image of the woman poet, then, ravening through domestic bric-a-brac and attempting to wrestle, wrench, and thieve a dryad of her own to secure her poetic fortune, is a grim satire of the woman's attempt to adopt a classicizing male poetic gaze that's characterized by gendered sexual violence. The grim comedy continues in the second poem. So perhaps on the advice of the doctor consulted in the first poem, in the second poem, our speaker attempts more concertedly to write an Ovidian poem, and this is on the plethora of dryads. Hearing a white saint rave about a quintessential beauty visible only to the paragon heart, I tried my sight on an apple tree, for eccentric knob and wart had all my love. Without meat or drink, I sat, starving my fantasy down, to discover that metaphysical tree, which hid from my worldling look its brilliant vein, far deeper in gross wood than axe could cut. But before I might blind sense to see with the spotless soul, each particular quirk so ravished me, every pock and stain bulked more beautiful than flesh of any body flawed by love's prints. Battle, however I would, to break through that patchwork of leaves, bicker and whisk in babel tongues, streak and mottle of torn bark, no visionary lightnings pierced my dense lid. Instead, a wanton fit dragged each dazzled sense apart, surfeiting eye, ear, taste, touch, smell. Now, snared by this miraculous art, I ride earth's burning carousel, day in, day out, and such grit corrupts my eyes. I must watch sluttish dryads twitch their multifarious silks in the holy grove, until no chaste tree but suffers blotch under flux of those seductive reds, greens, blues. The difference between masculine and feminine poetic vision that was set up in the first poem is staged in the second as a battle of representation that the woman poet loses just as she is expressing her love for, perhaps quietly celebrating her vision of the tree that stays tree. She's suddenly overwhelmed by the longed-for miraculous art that will enable her to concoct a Daphne, and it turns out to be a disaster. For in a classic comedy of unintended consequences, she can now see nothing but sluttish dryads wherever she looks. Turns out to be not quite the gift she wished for. But Plath undermines the comedy again by saturating the poem with verbs of violence. As we had ravening in the first poem, here we've got break, streak, pierce, drag, snare. And this is both a duplication of her technique in the first poem and an extension of its critique of Ovidian poesis. And while at the end of the poem we're told no chaste tree remains safe from the woman poet's new gaze, it is in fact the speaker who's the object of the verb ravished in stanza 3. And so the sexual violence of the classicising male gaze boomerangs back to the woman poet. We might say, given that the poem is working with the logic of the metamorphoses, that as the reward for her attempt to seize poetic agency, she's punished in a distinctly Ovidian way. Note also how Plath emphasises the misogyny of the woman poet's new vision. The dryads are wanton, sluttish grit who corrupt and blotch. One conclusion we may draw from this is that in donning this quintessentially male poetic mantle, the possibility of a feminine subjectivity, certainly a feminist subjectivity, has been completely obliterated. Plath suggests that the stakes are high for women who seek to write classicising poetry. But it's also really funny, right? Radiant nymphs, wherever you look, as a kind of curse of the male poet. But in addition to the Dryad poem's pastiche of an Ovidian poetics, I think that Plath is also wryly satirising her own impulse to write classicising poetry as the good student of modernism that she is. And she develops this self-parody in a different key in a poem written 3 years later, The Colossus, which is an explicitly reflexive and meta-theatrical comic critique and an engagement with the classical canon. So in this poem, the speaker is figured as a priestess figure who has devoted herself to tending the eponymous Colossus, an Oedipal proto-Bloomian father. It says, I shall never get you put together entirely, pieced, glued and properly jointed. Mule bray, pig grunt and bawdy cackles proceed from your great lips. It's worse than a barnyard. Perhaps you consider yourself an oracle, mouthpiece of the dead or some god or other. 30 years now I've laboured to dredge the silt from your throat. I'm none the wiser. Scaling little ladders with glue pots and pails of Lysol, I crawl like an ant in mourning over the weedy acres of your brow to mend the immense skull plates and clear the bold white tumuli of your eyes. A blue sky out of the Oresteia arches above us. Oh, Father, all by yourself, you're pithy and historical as the Roman Forum. I open my lunch on a hill of black cypress. Your fluted bones and acanthine hair are littered in their old anarchy to the horizon line. It would take more than a lightning stroke to create such a ruin. Nights, I squat in the cornucopia of your left ear out of the wind, counting the red stars and those of plum colour. The sun rises under the pillar of your tongue. My hours are married to shadow. No longer do I listen for the scrape of a keel on the blank stones of the landing. You'll have noticed that the mood of the poem changes quite significantly towards the end, but it opens almost as a farce, with the speaker of the poem describing the absurd Freudian situation in which she spent 30 years devoted to a futile, repetitive, Sisyphean task that's done her no good. She says, I'm none the wiser. The speaker doesn't provide an explanation for her tending of the Colossus. She merely seems stuck in the habit, even though she mocks the pronouncements of the Colossus as a bestial din worse than a barnyard, a playful twist from bees to mules of the mellifluous poetic canon. The 4 stanzas' explicit appeal to Aeschylus's Oresteia signals that this comic figure should be read as the classical as well as the Freudian Electra, perhaps Electra at the opening of the Coephoroi tending Agamemnon's tomb. But the speaker has none of the gravitas we might expect from a tragic heroine, and in fact she makes herself look ridiculous. She describes herself as a surreally diminutive figure, an ant in mourning who must climb little ladders to scale the vast Colossus and keep on top of the weeding. Plath was familiar with all 3 ancient Electra plays, so this might be Plath being a little bit Euripidean here. And I'm glad that Polly has already raised the point in the seminar series that Electra can be played for laughs, because I think that's what Plath is doing here. It's almost a bit slapstick, this Lilliputian Electra with her mop and bucket. And this vaudevillian atmosphere is emphasised by Plath's mention of the blue sky out of the Oresteia, which draws attention to the action of the poem as a scene taking place on a stage with a painted backdrop. And I make this argument here because Plath makes this literal staging much more explicit in another of her Electra poems, Electra on Azalea Path, And the speaker of that poem draws attention to the fact that she borrows, as she says, the stilts of an old tragedy, as well as pointing to the actors on stage and to the artificial red dye of the stage props, which she describes as ersatz petals. And so a further layer of the comic here is Plath's overdetermination ad absurdum of the figure of Electra, as all of theatre's Electras, from Aeschylus to Eugene O'Neill, as well as that of Young too, all at once. Alongside these meta-theatrical elements, Plath has also shifted her meta-poetic analysis of classicism, what it is and what it does. Because in the Dryad poems, classicism was presented as an act of mimesis, or perhaps just what doing poetry is. But in the Colossus, Plath stages the repetitive tending of the father oracle canon, and it frames reception as an active process of reconstruction. The speaker has laboured to put together the Colossus. And without the active intervention of the attendant priestess, the fragments of the Colossus lie about like history's rubbish. Without it is suggested its hegemonic power. She says the fragments are littered in their old anarchy. One concern the Colossus shares with the earlier Dryad poems is with the price for such daughterly devotion. As in the 5th stanza, we learn that the Colossus provides a shelter for the speaker out of the wind in return for her labour of reconstruction. The daughter figure's return to the protection of the father Colossus now triggers a poetic overdetermination of the classical in the final stanza, which, as at the close of the 2nd Dryad poem, overwhelms both the comic tone and also the identity of the speaker of the poem. Because in 3 dense lines of classical allusions, the speaker is first an Electra or Antigone married to Shadow, then a Clytemnestra, or perhaps a Penelope or Ariadne who no longer listens for the scrape of a keel. The subjectivity of the speaker was already difficult to pinpoint, but now it's been completely overwritten. And it's a really ambivalent ending. Has the patriarch returned home, or has the speaker given up all hope of being rescued? The tragic archetypes the speaker turns to in the final 3 lines seem to offer no way out of her absurd situation, and her tending of the Colossus is constructed as a lonely task. I also want to draw your attention just briefly to the fact that Plath's Electra is tending the Colossus with pails of bleach. Now, Plath might be using Lysol here to make a joke about classical reception as another form of gendered labour, perhaps, with the woman poet engaging with male models. And I think Plath's emphasis is on the gendered implications of this illusion. But the connotations of Lysol as a bleaching agent really leap out at us today as the price of entry to classicism for white women, which is to keep classics white, particularly in the 1950s as well. So I'm going to park it for now, but kind of think about that, keep that pail of bleach in mind. So the comic in Plath can also occur in moments of incongruity or impropriety, comic timing and surprise. So take the opening line of Plath's poem Lesbos, for example, viciousness in the kitchen. It's a line that acts as punchline to the poem's elusive title, and which immediately upends any readerly expectation that we might be entering a sapphic idyll. And note again, particularly in that first stanza, that Plath is drawing our attention to the props of the poem's vaudevillian mise-en-scène, the windowless Hollywood studio, the fake doors, the stage curtains, the wig. And this is part of, as I argue, Plath's always knowing, always meta-theatrical classical reception practice. Incongruity and surprise, like in Lesbos, are also in operation in the poem Perda, in which Plath's veiled speaker awaits the arrival of a bridegroom, and I will come back to this in a second. Jade, stone of the side, the agonised side of green Adam, I smile, cross-legged, enigmatical, shifting my clarities. So valuable, how the sun polishes this shoulder. And should the moon, my indefatigable cousin, rise with her cancerous pallors, dragging trees, little bushy polyps, little nets, my visibilities hide, I gleam like a mirror. At this facet the bridegroom arrives, lord of the mirrors. It is himself he guides in amongst these silk screens, these rustling appurtenances. I breathe, and the mouth veil stirs its curtain. My eye veil is a concatenation of rainbows. I am his. Even in his absence, I revolve in my sheath of impossibles, priceless and quiet, amongst these parakeets, macaws, chatterers. Attendant of the eyelash, I shall unloose one feather like the peacock. Attendants of the lip, I shall unloose one note, shattering the chandelier of air that all day plies its crystals a million ignorance. Attendants, attendants. And at his next step, I shall unloose from the small jeweled doll he guards like a heart, the lioness, the shriek in the bath, the cloak of holes. The revelation that the speaker we've been listening to is Clytemnestra heightens both the horror of the final stanza and the outburst of violence after the technical control of the speaker's performance, which takes the form of an erotically deferred striptease set up by Plath's tantalising use of enjambment throughout the poem and that proleptic repetition, I shall unloose one feather, I shall unloose, I shall unloose. And this striptease effect is heightened if we read Purda alongside another equally problematic poem that Plath composed in the same week as Purda, Lady Lazarus. We might say that it's another reception poem, calling on Lazarus. It uses the same stanza form, and it also has this phoenix and the flames ending. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. That I'll come back to very shortly. So the coup de théâtre of the final stanza, that revelation that we've been listening to Clytemnestra, sends us back to the beginning of the poem. And we now reread the poem's cliched Orientalism and reframe its presentation of a passive femininity through the cool, murderous irony of Aeschylus's Clytemnestra. I'm surprised that Plath's Purda and her use of Clytemnestra here has been neglected in feminist classical reception scholarship, because I think it's so open to that kind of feminist reading that I problematized earlier that would see this ending as a triumphant feminist revenge fantasy. Perhaps it's the proximity of Orientalism and classicism here that makes scholars uncomfortable. And Plath's appropriation of the feminized, colonized other for her poem Speaker here is, of course, highly problematic. I find it useful to think about this poem by drawing on a paper Leila Kamali delivered at the Sylvia Plath Symposium last year, in which she theorised Plath's tendency to appropriate the subjectivity of negatively racialised others in poems such as Purda. Kamali noted that Plath typically does this when she's attempting to express an unease with embodiment or to express a state of abjection. And Kamali proposed that Plath is beginning to make political connections with others through a sense of shared oppression. What Kamali is arguing is that what Plath is articulating, although she doesn't know it, is her struggle with femininity as it is conceptualized under white supremacy. But as Kamali reminds us, the Cambridge-trained Plath is starting from a colonial reading list when she looks for languages, images, and archetypes to express a critique. And so it's clumsy and offensive. Kamali says that Plath's reading list has a lot to answer for. But rereading Purda through Kamali's analytic allows us to see how Plath positions Clytemnestra as just one more patriarchal cliche in her satirical catalogue of fetishized femininity, the monstrous flip side of an Orientalist fantasy. And I think Plath's use of the word concatenation in stanza 10, which literally means a series of things chained together, suggests that Plath is consciously providing the key for how her series of images should be read. The poem's critique of patriarchal representations of women thus seems to conclude that adopting Clytemnestra's voice offers no way out of the trap of femininity either. In offering this reading, I'm not seeking to excuse Plath's obviously appropriative and objectionable move here, but I do think we have to pay attention to it. And I think there's more to learn for feminists, for feminist reception scholarship, if we acknowledge the ways that a proto-feminist critique, classical allusion, and negatively racializing imagery sit alongside each other in this poem. And I think it's that knot of associations that might be a further reason why this poem has been ignored by feminist classical reception scholarship. Feminist receptions are meant to be positive and empowering, although unfortunately that's often in a way that reifies the classical rather than critiques it. So, Edge. This is the last poem I wanted to share with you, and it's definitely not funny, ha-ha, but I hope you'll agree that its bitter burlesque picks up some of the themes and also the approaches of the poems that I've already discussed, as well as the fact that it speaks much more to the modern sense of the burlesque as a spectacularization of women's bodies. The woman is perfected. Her dead body wears the smile of accomplishment. The illusion of a Greek necessity flows in the scrolls of her toga. Her bare feet seem to be saying, "We have come so far, it is over." Each dead child coiled a white serpent, one at each little pitcher of milk now empty. She has folded them back into her body as petals of a rose close when the garden stiffens and odours bleed from the sweet, deep throats of the night flower. The moon has nothing to be sad about, staring from her hood of bone. She is used to this sort of thing. Her blacks crackle and drag. This is one of the last poems that Sylvia Plath composed before she died. And unfortunately, it's been widely and literally interpreted as the suicide note of a doomed tragic heroine. As Heather Clark notes in her recent biography of Plath, quote, "No other poem in Plath's oeuvre, perhaps in any poet's oeuvre, has been as biographically determined as Edge," unquote. In an essay published 8 years after Plath's death, Elizabeth Hardwick challenged critics to read Sylvia Plath's poems as if she was still alive, arguing that in this light, the woman in Grecian dress, each dead child coiled at her breasts, quote, "seems to be a Greek heroine, Medea perhaps, once more," unquote. One implication of Hardwick's argument, that if Plath had not died 6 days after composing Edge, readers would perhaps only see Medea in the poem, is that, whittled of biographical associations, the literary classicism of Plath's poetry comes to the fore. Now, while the tangled threads of biographical and classical allusion in Plath's poetry can be difficult to entwine, and I think Plath invites it at several points, I think we should pay attention to Plath's insistence in line 4 here of the illusion of this poem's scene. The spectacularized tableau of Edge, which may be nodding to the display of Clytemnestra's body at the close of Aeschylus' Grifory, signals that Plath is once again staging a classical illusion for us. And this staging is heightened by Plath's allusion to a Greek necessity in line 4. Because the Greek necessity, Ananke, to which Euripides' Medea appeals, once she has set in motion the chain of events that will lead to the murder of her children, is rewritten in Seneca's version of the play as the moment at which the heroine metatheatrically announces her final metamorphosis into her tragic literary archetype. Now I am Medea. I think Plath is utilising the self-conscious Medea in Edge to forestall and mock the reader's biomythographical impulse with a scripta puella who only seems to adopt the illusion of a tragic archetype in the scrolls and, we might say, metrical feat of her poetic self-representation. Like Seneca's Medea, the dead woman of Edge wears the smile of accomplishment as she fulfills the patriarchal fantasy of a woman aestheticised in death as a perfected subject for poetry. And there's a double movement of complicity and critique here between an irreverent but densely elusive engagement with her classical source texts and a chilling and deadly serious assessment of those texts' representation of women, a tension between her invocation of a tragic archetype and her refusal of its utility. She says it's illusory. And there's not only Medea in this poem. Plath gets in an allusion to Ariadne because this poem reprises imagery from a series of earlier ekphrastic poems that she wrote addressed to the neoclassical paintings of Giorgio de Chirico and their uncanny landscapes populated by women in gowns of stone. The image of serpents at the woman's breasts in this poem immediately evokes Cleopatra, who dies in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra marble constant. And the archaism that opens the poem, perfected, embeds a further oblique allusion to Clytemnestra and her ironic words of welcome to the doomed Agamemnon as a sacrificial victim. And I've just included a nice detail on screen there, which is Plath's underlining of Clytemnestra's perfected in her Penguin edition of the Agamemnon. So Plath is burlesquing the archetype of the tragic heroine itself, with this series of allusions to Medea, Ariadne, Cleopatra, and Clytemnestra that overdetermine the classical precedent she dares us to read in the poem, much as she did with Electra in the poem The Colossus. Plath's overdetermination of the classical ad absurdum here, a commedia of a stock female type, confounds any attempt to locate a singular source text for the poem. The joke here appears to be on the classicizing impulse of the reader. So rather than engaging with a particular classical myth or narrative then, in this poem, Plath seems to be invoking a discourse of classicized femininity. That she's working with a hegemonic discourse of classicism might also explain why, in 20 short lines, the reader encounters snow, frost, bone, milk, a toga, white serpents, and the moon, all images prosaically or explicitly linked to whiteness, which is as overdetermined in the poem as is the classical. Or perhaps we might better say that this overdetermination of whiteness is part of the overdetermination of the classical. Plath seems to have detected some of the ideological freight, to use Lorna Hardwick's recent phrasing, of the hegemonic discourse of classicism with which she and her socio-cultural milieu absorbed and engaged. As a child of World War II, familiar with fascism's classicized scopic regime, this ideological freight perhaps seemed obvious to Plath. And we might compare her use of the classical in one of her most famous poems, Daddy, in which the image of the Colossus of Constantine, which she describes as a marble statue with one grey toe, is simply one metonym in a list of metonyms for Nazism. At the same time, however, Plath may have intended to emphasise the gendered implications of those images of whiteness in edge, particularly the moon, milk, and the serpents. But as we have seen, these associations keep on cropping up in her classicising poems. And from either perspective, this hegemonic discourse of classicism is fatal for the poem's gendered subject. Plath isn't using myth to give voice to women's concerns, but she's offering us a gendered critique of classicism, one that dredges up classicism's ideological accretions and puts them on stage. So now that you have a flavour of Plath's classicism and the comic, the absurd, the burlesque, I want to zoom back out and return to where I started, which was thinking about the way that the discipline of classics has attempted to occlude or sideline reception's potential as an analysis of power, and also classicist psychic investments in reception studies as well, also the comic. I mentioned at the beginning that Plath has been neglected in feminist classical reception scholarship. And this exclusion is all the starker because of Plath's exemplary inclusion in the essay which is often situated as the touchstone framework for thinking about women's revisionary myth-making, Adrienne Rich's 1972 essay, Writing as Revision. It's a much quoted essay, and I've included the most excerpted lines as the first quotation on this slide. It's a quotation that I'm sure many of you will know off by heart. But the essay bears revisiting, particularly because Rich's use of Plath's poetry and her formulation of revision doesn't have anything to do with Plath's classical reception practice at all. What Rich pinpoints as the importance of Plath's poetry to the new possibilities for women's poetry, as she says, as we try to find language and images for a consciousness we're just coming into and with little in the past to support us, is the way that Plath's poetry names the power of the patriarchy and attempts to construct what Rich calls a woman's sense of herself against that power. In Plath's poetry, Rich writes, man appears as a fascination and a terror, and the source of the fascination and the terror is simply man's power. Until recently, this furious awareness of the man's power were not available materials to the female poet. Plath's importance, then, is not her engagement with myth per se, but her attempt to name myth as one of the discursive and representational technologies of patriarchy. And it's this aspect of Plath's poetry that Rich points to explicitly position revision as an act of awakening consciousness. I suggested in my analysis of the poem Purdah that the discomfort reception scholars have identified at the centre of Plath's reception practice might be located in the proximity of that poem among many others of Plath's, of a proto-feminist critique, classical illusion, and orientalizing imagery. I still think that's true, and it's something that needs to be carefully theorized and accounted for. I don't think it's helpful to say that it's not feminist, for example. But after rereading Rich's essay, I would now also add that it's Plath's use of the classics as a cipher in her analysis of patriarchal power, and in particular, her use of the classical to articulate her disempowerment that feminist classical scholars have found so uncomfortable. One final additional source of discomfort for the feminist reception scholar lies in the fact that Plath frequently achieves her comic critique by burlesquing her own complicity in a classicizing impulse. That is, it's the classicizing woman who is often the butt of the joke in Plath's poems. Maybe classicists don't find this funny. In a paper titled Classics and Disturbing Attachments in HBO's Succession, delivered at last year's Queer and the Classical conference, Eleonora Colley drew out the ways in which a running joke in the TV series Succession about Nero and Sporus, a joke which so delighted classicists, is actually deployed in context as a power move by one character over another who lacks the same institutional power and upper class educational background. Colley asks us, is this a joke at which we should really be laughing along? Is this a joke we should feel pleased to have got? Aren't we now complicit with that character's power move? I think we should reflect on that. So by way of conclusion, the comic mode allowed Plath to express her most biting critiques of classicism, including her own classicism. And so Plath's classical burlesques remind feminists that if we're going to accept Adrienne Rich's challenge to engage in a reflexive revision of patriarchy's texts, we're going to need to be able to laugh at ourselves.